The fall of Rome. So, what exactly happened to Rome? Its fall can be attributed to many different causes, but before that, let me give you a brief overview of what exactly happened. It was a dark and stormy night sometime in the 3rd century. Germanic tribes were surrounding Rome and continued their efforts to take over some of Rome's land, but to little success. Later, the Huns coming from the east pushed the Germanic tribes up against Rome. Eventually, some of the Germanic tribesmen, or barbarians as the Romans called them, slipped into Rome and integrated themselves into the empire. Eventually, they would rebel and cause ruckus, but we'll dive into more detail about that in a bit. So, how were these Germanic tribes able to muscle their way into the Roman Empire? Well, fewer people were willing to join the army. In addition, the small, low-budget army didn't want to fight. So, what did Rome do? They recruited barbarians into their army. This will pose a problem for the military, as we will explain later. In addition, Rome's government was falling. It was very low budget, like the army, and there was a lot of conflict between the many rulers. The government, which was falling apart on the inside, was, not surprisingly, unable to perform the task which Rome needed to survive. Another thing that had a hard blow on Rome was the plague. It killed like 10% of their entire population, which is quite a bit considering how massive the Roman Empire was. There was nothing really to be happy about when the people were dying, and it had its severe impacts across Rome as well. So, to sum all of this up into one very oversimplified statement, Rome basically lived through a series of very unfortunate events, and this gave rise to other significant problems across Rome as well. So, let's unpack the various internal and external problems that would eventually knock out Rome. To start off, we'll start with everybody's favorite, barbarians.
One of the first problems that arose in the fall of Rome was the invasion of Germanic tribes. These tribes were gradually pushing into the empire and were repeatedly defeating and overstretching the empire's army. With the arrival of the Huns, the tribes were pushed more forcefully into Rome, causing them to sack less and start to take land to stay. Eventually, the tribes were winning enough ground that they began to claim this land as kingdoms within the empire. The second problem that the Romans faced was their army. They needed a boost in their military, so they added none other than the Germanic tribesmen that had been attacking them for years. It seemed to be okay at first because it fixed the problem with the size and it got many of the Germanic tribes to stop attacking. But then it became a problem. This boost became a problem because the military's main strength was teamwork, discipline, and vigorous training. The newly joined tribesmen often lacked the discipline to conform to this. Another military issue was the size of the army. The army had to be big enough to protect the empire, but also had to be small enough to be controlled by the government. In the end, a smaller army was settled for, but it cost Rome a great deal of land and security. These problems led to a largely unprotected empire, mainly governed by those that had not governed it originally.
Depopulation was another one of the problems that could have helped bring the fall of Western Rome. Disease killed 10% of the population. Losing that many people caused a lot of issues in pulling in tax money. Since there were fewer people to pay taxes, the government got less tax revenue, meaning less to pay military officials, leading to less loyalty from the military. They tried to stop that by letting officers pay fewer taxes, but that decreased the revenue even more, meaning even less money to spend on the military, which ended up weakening central power. Depopulation also meant that there was a lot more unused farmland, so Rome would have problems producing resources. The unused farmland also had an effect on Rome's economy. A combination of disease-related deaths and people fleeing from high taxes meant that landlords could collect a ton of land. They replaced slaves with tenant farmers and ended up gaining a lot of power. The estates that they had created were self-sustainable and important to local economies. The landlords also found ways to weasel out of paying huge taxes. They were such an influential power that they got involved in the political system, then managed to mess it up and help wear down its core. High taxes, as previously mentioned, were another difficulty. Factors such as Diocletian's reforms and loss of people to disease meant that the government needed more money than they could normally obtain. Taxes were raised for peasants and poor tenant farmers, and greatly damaged the middle class, which prevented it from growing. They were so bad that people and their children were basically tied to their jobs. Another big issue in the economy of Rome was the devaluation of coins. Silver coins were quickly losing their percentage of silver and ended up being mostly bronze. This led to people hoarding money, because old coins would be worth a lot more than new ones. The hoarding essentially took a ton of money out of circulation. To try to compensate, the government kept producing more and more money, which of course led to inflation. Stuff rose in price, but wages didn't rise as quickly as prices, leading to economic distress. One of the things that kept the Western Roman economy going was trade, and that began to fall apart too. Certain guilds were regressing in quality and disappearing due to less demand as people didn't have money to spend. Western Rome had previously done a lot of international trade, but that was largely taken over by the Easterners. Frontier trade around Germany could have also been a huge market, but imperial restrictions prevented most stuff from crossing the borders. Trading was bound to spiral downward anyway, as other problems made sure Rome didn't have enough resources to support itself, much less to trade internationally.
In addition to the many problems Western Rome faced, the government was failing. The old, strong, efficient government was faced with the many problems associated with the 5th century crisis in the following century, which led to the Western Empire being unable to maintain stability. One major issue the government faced was a lack of support within the Roman population. The major landowners were meant to provide support by paying taxes, avoided them, and the provincial governors were out of the control of the government. As a result, people in general just stopped working, which led to the government's funding being limited. There was also corruption and bribery that were ongoing problems within the government. In response to these problems, the government enforced imperial authority. Taxes were raised and were payable in services, which led to people being locked into a certain job to pay them off. With the lack of money and the failing system, the government was unable to respond to external threats and even to provide men for the military. The Western Romans, with all the issues they were facing, still had one major problem to deal with: demoralization. The Western Roman population became discouraged as more and more problems presented themselves, and their support for the Western Roman Empire stopped or simply decreased dramatically. And this wasn't only in the military. The flawed, corrupt government provided the public with a view of only withdrawn emperors, oppressive officials who seemed to care only for themselves, and cruel imperial authority, which made the public's dedication to the good of Western Rome stop. Of course, with the lack of dedication in the people, it comes as no surprise that Western Rome was no longer able to run efficiently. But why did Western Rome fall while Eastern Rome survived? First of all, the problems that both West and East faced were similar. However, the East had better political stability and a wealthier population, which allowed it to afford a better defense system. The West was more exposed than the East and didn't have the same efficient system of defense because of its extensive frontiers and relative lack of money compared to the East. In addition, the West had heavily relied on barbarians, although they were a threat to the system, which in the end was a big factor in their downfall. Plus, the West faced the full brunt of many military, governmental, and economic factors and was unable to support itself.